So last session we discussed about how we can deal with the data binding. So how we can work with the data binding options, right? Yes. And in the data binding, we have learned about interpolation. What is interpolation, right? Yeah. Okay. So next, after understanding about interpolation and few more important things. So we are looking at one-way binding. How one-way binding works. And in one-way binding, so interpolation is done by using angular data binding expression. So we use data binding expression. Now another option is you can bind to a property and you can bind to attributes. Interpolation is directly not binding to any element. It is not binding to any element. So it is binding to, it is just displaying as literal actually. So binding to element and binding to property. Property element is through property and attribute. Two options are there. I think you already know the difference actually. So what is difference between a property and attribute? So you know that attributes are defined for tags. Attributes are usually defined for tags and they are statically used. Elements, HTML elements are defined with attributes statically. And we define through the tags actually. For example, we have img src. So in the img src, so we are defining some pic.jpg and we are writing some class is equal to img some thumbnail like this. So in this class and the src are attributes actually. So when you are trying to dynamically control, that means a point is attributes are immutable. That means their state cannot change dynamically. Attribute cannot change their state dynamically. Whereas properties are defined. This is general HTML thing. I am explaining one more time. Properties are defined dynamically. Generally, element can be dynamically configured with the properties. Suppose we are creating a picture, new image, and pic.src. So this is src is a property, and when you are defining the properties, I hope you already know in JavaScript that the attribute name is class and the property name may not be the same every time. Here attribute is src and property is also src. But pick dot property is class. SRC we don't have property, we don't have class. Actually, it is class name. That means sometimes the attribute name and property name may be same, but sometimes the property name and attribute name will be different. When you are statically defining, you use one name. When you are dynamically defining, there will be a different name. Sometimes it is same, sometimes it is different. So properties are mutable. They can change dynamically. They can change dynamically. So some differences what you observe generally in HTML is, generally in HTML you use the attributes, and in JavaScript and jQuery, when you are dynamically handling them, we use properties. And one important point is you can bind to attribute or you can bind to property. But what is problem you will face while binding with property and attributes is some elements don't have the same name properties. So that means some elements don't have the properties that you use as attributes. So then you have to use a different approach for applying them. We have to follow a different approach. I will give you a simple option. Suppose we are applying some options, like suppose there is table. When you are working for a table have an attribute called width. Width attribute, you can define some width. But a table attribute, you can define height. Height also you can define table. But technically, table element dynamically, it is having width, but it is not having height. That means no height property. Height is available as attribute, but height is not available as a property. In that case, applying any value into it will be a difficult task. I will show you how you can manage that, how you can define that. So let's see the difference between property binding and attribute binding. So for example, yesterday I showed you we created an object, and the object is product. The product object contains some properties here: name, price, stock. These we need to display. In a table. And to display in a table, so we are using interpolation. This is interpolation. Or we can bind with any property, binding with the property. That means if you want to bind to the property, so of table cell, let's run this and see. Project is equal to Amazon. Okay. If I want to bind to this table cell, now if you want to bind to any property, then we have to use properties are defined in the square brace. And the property name, so inner HTML, and into that we have to apply the value that is product dot price. We are binding that. That means we can bind any value to the property dynamically. So that means we are binding by using property binding technique. We are attaching to the property binding technique. Interpolation will not bind with any element. Interpolation will just display as a literal. So because this is interpolation, you see we have interpolation. Interpolation is not binded with this table cell. It is just used as a literal normal text. It is just used as a literal here. It is used as a literal here. It is not binded with that element. So if you want to bind, so because whenever the changes occurred, we want to reflect the changes into that particular element, we have to bind to the property. And the properties are this. So that is the property we are binding. Now observe carefully here. So once it is ready, let's run this and see. So all these details are displayed in the same way, no change. So I will compile this. And you can see the details are displayed here. So that means name, price. We are using property binding technique. Now, one of the main concept here is, suppose observe carefully, I am adding a table here. Table. For table, I am giving some border as 1. And in that we have some row. In that some cell, name. Another cell, price, something. This is a general table available here. So we have a table. So here we have a heading, some table. Okay. You see we have a table here. So name and price. For this table above, I am giving an attribute. So width is an attribute. And see, I said 300, width 300. The table width is adjusted here. You can see width is adjusted. I am giving height attribute, height as 100. And you can see that height is also defined here. Height is also adjusted. But if you know HTML, I hope you might have learned in HTML that table don't have height property. So what properties table is having? Height is an attribute here. As an attribute, it is available. But as a property, it is not available. As a property, it is not available. So table is not having height property. How you know that? Generally in HTML, we can know that. For example, suppose I am showing you a simple HTML page. I am showing a simple HTML. Here I am writing a script. Just I am showing you that table is having the property or not. So function. Okay. And let's define here. So where table tab is equal to document dot create element table. We are creating table element table, and I want to know the table properties. So for where property in tab, and I will display the properties here. So document dot write. So the property. Okay. All the properties I am printing here just to show you. Let's run this and see. You can see it is going to display the list of all table properties. Observe carefully. Here I will search here. I will find here width. You can see width property is available. Width is available. And I am searching for border. Border is also available. I am searching for height. Height is not available. You can see some offset height is there. Client height is there. Offset height is, client height is there. Scroll height is there. But only height is not available. That means every HTML attribute that you use in HTML is not available as a property. Generally, if you learned HTML and JavaScript, generally you know this. Then if I want to dynamically change the height of table, then how to dynamically change the height of table? To dynamically change the height of table, we don't have height property. Then what we have to do is, actually observe, table have an attribute called class. But you search here, table have no class property. It is class name or class list. There is no directly class. So the attributes that you know in HTML, you can directly use them as properties sometime. Sometimes you cannot do that because those names are not available as properties. You have to know the name and you have to use. Sometimes those are not available at all as properties. When they are not available as properties, you have to think about alternative. That means height is not available for table as an property. Then you cannot adjust the height. You cannot adjust the height. Then generally how JavaScript people adjust the height of table dynamically. Then what they do is they do that by using, so they access document get element by ID, get element by ID. So they access the table, so table ID, they access the table by ID, and for that they use style. Through style they will keep the height, and height is equal to 400 pixels, like that. That means if it is not available directly as a property, then we have to apply through styles. That is the basic approach we need to follow, and generally people know this, that every attribute that we use in HTML is not available as a property. Then they have to use alternative techniques. So here also the same concept. Observe carefully here. Now I want to change the width and height of table. I want to change the width and height of table dynamically. Then in the code, I will write two properties. Table width is equal to 300. Okay. And the table height is equal to 100. Okay. Now currently table is present normal. The above table is present normal. I want to apply these to the table. Let's go to the table. Now table is having the width property. So if you want to bind any dynamic value to the property, then properties are defined in square brace. In the square brace, I am writing here, so width, and I am accessing the value. So from the property table width and applying it. That means in table width property, whatever value you have defined, you are applying to width. Now you see it is applying to the width. Okay. I am trying the same property binding for height. I will use square brace and I write height, and here I want to apply table height. Table height. I am applying table height, but you have a problem here. So immediately Angular says that I cannot bind to height since it is not a known property of table. Anybody who knows HTML, he knows that. That means you cannot bind every dynamic value directly to properties because some properties are not available to use dynamically. The attributes that you know in HTML are not available as properties. Then there is no other chance. You have to tell Angular that, okay, if it is not available as a property, then bind to the attribute height. then you have to tell the angler that you bind this to the attribute height, not to the property height, because there is no height property. You have to tell angler that. Then you can do that. Then you can do that. So by using ATTR dot height, ATTR dot height, this indicates angler, this tells the angler that this is not a property, this is an attribute. Then angler will transform this into an attribute and it will bind it to the attribute. Directly it cannot bind to properties. That means, remember, many times people ask which one is best. Always binding to property is best, because if you are dealing with dynamically, binding to property is best. But it is not possible every time. It is not possible every time because every attribute is not available as property. Then obviously you have to use attribute binding, and you can see that now it will apply to the attribute. Height is adjusted. If I don't use ATTR, immediately it says that I don't know any height for table. But remember, table have an height option. So when you are using as an attribute, directly you can use height. Suppose, see here, there is another option. I'm writing like this. I'm writing like this. So table have an height attribute. Into the height attribute, we are applying a dynamic value. Into the height attribute, by using interpolation, we are applying a dynamic value. And dynamic value is table height. Dynamic value is table height. We are applying table height. And you can see that through the attribute, if you are trying to apply, still it is not possible. Why? Because dynamically you cannot apply any value to attributes. Attributes are static. Any dynamic value cannot be applied to attribute. Right? Anything. That means any attribute cannot take the values dynamically. Any attribute cannot take dynamically. That is very important problem. That is very important problem when you are dealing with. So that means you cannot apply any dynamic value to attribute. You have to apply to property. Suppose if I write like in a square brace, then you are using interpolation technique. That is also wrong because there is no height. Suppose I said ATTR dot height. So this is also wrong because remember, if you are dynamically applying the value, then we don't use interpolation. We don't use interpolation. So interpolation is used only for literals, not for binding. Then we don't use interpolation. We just use the table height here. Interpolation is used only for literal. Interpolation is used only for literal, only for static values. So technically, when to bind to property, when to bind to attribute is the question. So you bind to property or you bind to attribute. It depends on whether it supports that or not. That means if an element is not supporting the property, then we bind to attribute. When we bind to attribute, so dynamically we have to manage that. Dynamically we need to configure and use this. So this is the basic thing you need to understand when you are dealing with, when you are configuring and dealing with data binding. So that means you can bind the data and display in the UI by using three mechanisms. One is interpolation. So that is this flower brace. Another one is property binding. Property binding. That means property is defined in square brace. And attribute binding. Attribute binding. So there we use ATTR dot attribute name, and any value. We have to define the value. And here, so we define the property name. Property name is equal to any value. The dynamic value that you have to display there, we can get it. So when to use property binding, when to use attribute binding, I hope everyone is clear with this. And attribute binding is used when that option is not available as a property, but it is available as an attribute. Then you have to tell Angular that apply to the attribute. Then it can apply to the attribute and it can use. So that is the actual concept of interpolation, property binding, and attribute binding. We will use in all occasions, in different occasions, we will see how to work with it and how to use it, right? So this is all three comes under the concept of, this all comes under the concept of one-way binding. All comes under the concept of one-way binding. So it is not two-way binding. It is not two-way binding. I will show you. So why it is one-way binding. Let's see. So already yesterday I showed you interpolation one-way binding. Here, let's keep this more simple. We have product name, price, and stock. Okay. And here I am displaying. So everything removed. I just keep here a data list, data term, and a name. And here I am displaying input type is equal to text. And I am displaying some message below this. I will keep a heading. So, and here I am displaying product name, and whatever the name is, that is product.name. Okay. So the product name is initially displayed here. I want to display the product name inside the text box also. That means for the text box, to which property we can apply that. So we can use square brace. You know, text box uses value property. To the value property, I need to apply product.name. That means it will display inside the text box. You see, text box is having this Samsung TV. That means the value is coming and it is binding. So this is property binding. This is property binding. You can use property binding, or here I am writing another way. I am writing value is equal to, I am using expression and product dot name. I am configuring in this way. That means I am applying to the attribute now. Attribute is also working fine. Because it is available as an attribute, it is available as a property. So you can apply like this. But this is not recommended, because if you want to dynamically handle that, then always use property binding. That means value, and here we have to bind product.name. Product.name. We need to bind the product name and configure the product name. And you can see that it is binded. Now the same is actually used here also. Observe carefully. The value is coming from the model and it is displayed in the view. I am making some changes in the view. That means I am changing this to Nike casuals and it is not updating here. It is not updating here. That means whatever the changes you've done in the view, it is not going back. It is only one direction. That means any change you made in the text box is not updated into this. That means it is just bringing it and displaying it. If I change the value in the text box, it is not updating here. That is the reason. If it is not updating there, then it cannot change it here. That means it is one direction only. Attribute binding, property binding, interpolation, all these are one direction only. they can bring the value and they can display the value. But any change performed in the value, it is not updated back. It is not updated back. So that is why these all three comes under one-way binding technique. These all three comes under one-way binding, one-way data binding. If you want the changes to be updated back, then we need two-way data binding. Two-way data binding. What is two-way data binding? The two-way data binding is nothing but you usually have a model. So we have model. Usually we have the model. And this model contains data. This model data is sent to the view. It is sent to the view. The model data is sent to the view. So that means we have a model and a view. This is view. That means whatever the changes, that means here. So this is the change. Okay. Whatever data is present, it is updated here. Whatever data is present, it is sent to the view. Whatever data is present, data is sent to the view. And whatever the change happened in the view, it is updated back to the model. So this mechanism is called as two-way binding. Previously, it was working only one direction. Model to view. But any change in the view is not updating back to the model. So that means if model is sending the data and allowing the updating of data from the view, that means model is having the value. So model is having the value. So before change, that means it is having the value before change. And it is having the value after change. That means, so model contains the information about the changes. If any component contains information about the changes, that means what is previous, what is current, then technically in software technologies, we call this mechanism as entire mechanism as single source of truth. At high level, in any interview, anybody may ask you, what is single source of truth? So which component refers single source of truth? Model refers single source of truth. Single source of truth is a very common architectural common design pattern that you will find in software designing, software development. And single source of truth indicates that a component contains information about the value before it changes and after it changes. It contains all the metadata about the changes happening in the value. That means it contains the previous value and it contains the current value. It contains the updating of the values. So that is referred as single source of truth. Information about value before and after change. So that is handled by model actually. So two-way binding. Two-way binding means any change in the model is updated to the view. Any change in the view is updated to the model. Previously, it was not happening. Now, how two-way binding is managed actually? How two-way data binding is managed? Actually, to manage two-way data binding, we have to follow a certain technical approach. What is the technical approach? Simply, see, you need to understand one basic thing. The data is going and from model. So data from model. Data from model is bind to view. So data from model is sent and it is bind to view. It is bind to view. So if data is going from the model and binding to view, how it binds the data to view? Usually to bind the data to the UI, model uses property binding. Property binding is done in square brace. So square brace is property binding. That means through property binding, the data from the model is attached to the UI. Okay. Now, any change made in the view is to be updated back to the model. How it knows that some change happened inside this text box? I think you know JavaScript jQuery. How to identify some change happened inside this text box? Usually we have an event like on key up. I hope you know. You need an event to identify. You need an event to identify the changes. On key up, on blur, on click. You need these events. In Angular, events are written in the parenthesis. We write on key up, on key up. So we generally write key up actually, key up. This is event. This is event. In Angular, events are defined in this parenthesis. This event notifies, this event notifies, this event notifies, this event notifies the changes happened inside the model. That means in the text box. In the view, if any change occurred, this event will fire up and it will notify the change. That means here, generally when you write in JavaScript or jQuery, you have on key up. And in Angular, events are written in this parenthesis. We have like load event, we have like click event, so we have like change event, we have like blur event. All these events are defined in the parenthesis. So first point, the model value comes, and it is attached to the view by using property binding. And this value, any change occurred will be updated. Any change occurred will be updated back to the model on event binding. That means changes are updated on event. So changes are updated on event. So that means two-way binding have to use two techniques, property binding and event binding. Detailing what is event binding you are going to learn in the next level. So this requires two options, property binding and event binding. And event binding is defined, events are defined in the parenthesis. This is event binding. That means generally, when you are dealing with the text box, we are dealing with the text box. Input type is equal to text. And here we have to use two important techniques. Square brace, that is property binding, and parenthesis, that is event binding. Square brace and parenthesis, the property and event binding. So that means we need to use this technique, the property and event binding. And through property and event binding, we need to access the data and we need to use the data and display the data. So we use property. And who is responsible for managing these two activities? Model. Model is responsible for handling these two activities. So these two, property and event binding, is managed by a model. In Angular, model is referred as ng model. So that means now model is responsible for bringing, remember in this, whatever the value, suppose we have product dot name. product dot name. So whatever product name is present, this is binded to the property by using the property binding technique. Is binded to the property. Square brace is property binding. And to which property it will bind? To which property it will bind? Model will bind to the property. What is the property? Value. To the value property, it will bind this value. It will bind this value. And not only that, if any change occurred inside the text box, then by using event binding technique, it will update the value here. It will update that value here. So that means, so many times, so in Angular, so many people have a doubt what this symbol donates, then what this symbol specifies. This indicates that you are using both property and event binding techniques. That means square brace is property binding and parenthesis is attribute event binding. And model is going to handle both property and event binding to get the value and to update the value. For that, actually, model have to store the data and handle the data, have to store the data and handle the data. That means we will apply this, the product name. So we will apply the product name to the model. Model, by using property and event binding technique, it can get the data and it can update the data also. But this ng model is not directly available. So in Angular, ng model is available in a forms module, and this forms module is present in Angular Forms library. It is present in Angular Forms library. So it is present in Angular Forms library. So in order to use ng module, you have to first import this module into your project, and you have to get it from this library and use it. Otherwise, it will not work. Let's do that now. So what we are doing here, so this is value. This is not great. Why? Because it is only one-way binding. Okay. Now I am using a square brace inside this parenthesis and ng model. And to that I am applying, so product dot name. Now what is the meaning of these two characters here? First one indicates I am using property binding. Through property binding, it will bring this value and show. Second one, through event binding, it will identify the changes in the value and updates back. So you see here, currently it shows an error, say ng model is not known. Why? Because ng model is present in a separate library. So we have to register it. How? We have to go to app module. Any modules you want to use, you have to register in app module. Go to app module .ts. In app module, all the modules are defined. In imports. Components are defined in declarations. Modules are defined in imports. In imports, we have to add a module called forms module. Actually, forms module is present in Angular Forms library. First, you have to import the forms module from Angular Forms library, and you have to register that forms module. So then save this, and you can see that now it is supporting this ng model. Otherwise, ng model is not supported without the form module. You have to make sure that you have configured the forms module. Now, once the forms module is defined and it is configured, the form module is defined and configured. And you can see here, so you can see here, we are now it is working with two ways. And you can see here, so whatever data is present, it has to come and display inside this. So inside this, currently, so it is not displaying any data inside it. Because Are there any technical issues inside it? Whatever the values are defined inside it, we can identify that. So we can identify and we can see that how it is handling the data. The concept is whatever the data is present here, so that is binded to this text box that is coming from the product name. Technically, you see, when I inspect here in the console, we don't have any problems. That means there is no problem in binding. Only the point is, so how the data comes and attaches also I will show you. We will discuss about them. Here I am making changes in the data Nike casuals. So this need to be updated back. This need to be updated back and displayed there. So that means whatever the changes you are making, these changes need to be updated back and displayed there. Let's create one simple example for that. So let's create one simple example. I will clean up this all. Okay. I'm cleaning up all this here. Yeah. Let's go to our PS file. And here we are configuring some details. Let's add some details first. So few basic details here. Suppose name. So name is some TV. Okay. And here we have price. So price is some 0. And shipped to is so some Hyderabad. Okay. And I'm just creating some properties. In stock is equal to some false. So false. These are the values we have individually. Later we will see objects and all other things also, how we can manage them and define them. Now I will go to here presentation, and here in the presentation, so we are designing a div, and in that I will put a class row, in that again a div, and here I am defining the class as column. So this is three columns. Okay, and beside that another div. And these are all bootstrap things. Yesterday I showed you how to handle bootstrap. So 9. Maximum columns are 12, right? We have to define that. Now, inside the column 3, so I'm defining a div. So class as form group. And here I'm defining a label name. And we have a text box. Input type is equal to text. Okay. And the class is equal to form control. That is the CSS for the text box. And we need to bind this name to the text box. But now we want two-way binding technique. Generally, one-way binding means we use a value and we can bind. In two-way binding, property binding, event binding, using ng model, we need to access that name and bind it. We are accessing the name and binding. That means we are just accessing the value and we are displaying the value. Through the model reference, we are configuring and using it. So that is the property and attribute binding. So similarly, we need to define for others. So I will copy this group. So a group. And in this group, so I'm adding another group. Okay, so this text box, let's keep in a correct presentation. Yeah, fine. Now I will keep this group, copy that group. Okay, and another one is for price. And model have to attach to the price. Fine, that is okay. And another div I will create here, and a class as form group. And here I am using so label as shipped to, and here we will keep a drop down. So we will keep a drop down. I'm just showing binding with all controls, different types of controls. So class form control, and here So I'm using, so simply, so same ng model, I need to bind shipper to property. And here we are having an option. So Delhi is an option. Another option is Hyderabad is an option. We are defining that. Fine. Next, important. So we have another div. So another div, and this is a class as form group. Okay, fine. And here, so we need to define a checkbox. Then I will just give label as so in stock, and put a div, and we are using input type is equal to checkbox. To checkbox, yes, and here we are adding ng model. So in stock, that gets a Boolean value, true or false. And checkbox uses a Boolean value to check and unchecked. Checked and unchecked gets from a Boolean value. So that it uses a Boolean value. So we are configuring all these details here. And you can see all the values are binded here. TV, price, Hyderabad, and in stock is false. Suppose I am changing this here. In stock is true. I am changing here in stock is true. Then automatically you can see that the checkbox will be checked there. It will be checked whatever the value you are configuring. That means the product details are defined here. The product details are defined left side. So, and I want to display the details. So, and I need to verify, are there any changes updated or not? I will use a simple data list, data term, name, and I need to access that name and display. Just only display. Then I will use here, so name. I'm accessing the name. Another data term. So another data term, and we are using price, and we need to access the price and display. Then price. And another data term, so in stock, so or simply shipper to, and that comes from shipper to, and I'm accessing here shipper to. And in stock, so that is a stock, and stock true or false is coming, then I will use a binding expression. So if in stock is equal to true, then we will put here the word a term called available. Otherwise we will put as out of stock. Just I'm writing a ternary operator here. Now you can see here those values will come here and display. Values come here in display right side. And I am making changes in this now. And it is updated there. That means it is handling two-way binding. I am adding the price here and it gets that price and display. I am changing the city, it is updating that here. I am changing the stock, it says out of stock. It says say yes, then it is available. So previously we were using property binding or attribute binding, which is one-way binding. It will simply get the data and it will display the data. But any change inside it cannot update the data back. That is what actually ng model is doing here. But ng model is single source of truth. It has to use two techniques, property binding, attribute binding. Through property binding, it will get the value and display. For that, we are using square brace. Through event binding, it will identify the changes in the value and update the changes. So two-way binding is handled in several ways. This is one regular method how we can manage. Later you will see other techniques also. But ng model is considered as the single source of truth because it contains the value before the change, after the change, and it updates the changes. Property and attribute binding will not allow the changes to update back to the model. But so this ng model can handle that. That is two-way binding technique. and we need to understand both one-way binding and two-way binding. And remember, NG model will not directly work. For that, first you have to go to app module and import forms module. So forms module allows you to use this NG model. Then we can handle it, right? First import the forms module and then you can use this NG model. So this is two-way binding technique. Now here currently we are using this with the MVC architecture. Angular supports another architecture, MVVM, model view model. In MVVM, all interactions are handled at view level. That means even the data is maintained in the view only. Controller will not have any work. Everything is managed at view level only. That means now you have seen MVC. That means from the controller data is coming. Data is in model, controller is sending the data to view. From view, again it is going to controller to the model. So that means controller plays the key role. Controller means this TS file, this plays the key role. From here data is coming, from here data is updated. So so in MVVM architecture, we will not have any controller. All the logic is maintained in the view level itself. So that is MVVM. So what is MVVM architecture? And how MVVM architecture is used so in Angular? So you have seen currently MVC architecture, model, view, controller. And what is MVVM? Without controller, how you can manage this? That is the MVVM approach. So how this MVVM works and how it is managed, that we will see in our next session, right? Tomorrow we will see that, right? Tomorrow we'll have session, no off, right? We will have session tomorrow. And in tomorrow's session, we will discuss how Angular uses this MVVM architecture. Okay, na? Right, tomorrow we'll continue. Yes, what is your doubt?
Yes,
Rahul?
yes, sir. Good morning. Sir, I have one question. Like, currently, we are creating the workspace, and inside workspace, we are creating the project, and we are running the project from the workspace location, right? But sir, if you are not creating the workspace and we are directly creating the project,
ng serve -- open. That's it.
Okay, and sir, from which location we need to fire this command?
So where you created your application.
Okay, means from the root project folder we need to fire this command. Okay, so what is the command? Can you please
repeat? ng serve --- open.
--- open. Okay, sir. Okay.